Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the third of our art talks here at the Lesley MFA in Visual Arts January 2021 residency. I'm the director of the program, Ben Sloat. For folks on our Zoom, I want to remind everyone to keep their mics muted and video off during the talk and during the Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll call on you. We start our public programs with a land acknowledgement. Lesley University here in Cambridge resides on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Massachusetts peoples, whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. We pay respect to the Massachusetts peoples and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land for generations, and we offer our appreciation to the lands and waters for sustaining us. Our general thematic for this residency is transformation in crisis, which considers various artistic methodologies and responses to times of uncertainty and upheaval. Our public programs began Sunday with a faculty panel led by MFA faculty Alex Jackson in conversation with Gerald Sheffield II and Jordan Seabrook, and continuing Monday with the mixed media performance-based artist Rebecca Belmore, and yesterday with visiting faculty Nikita Gale. Our art talk series continues tomorrow with the mixed media painter Eric N. Mack, and concludes Friday with the sculptor Doris Salcedo. I hope those watching the live stream on the front page of our website can join us for those programs. Today's speaker is Ruth Erickson, and I first became acquainted with the work of Ruth in the group exhibition at the ICA Boston, which opened in the fall of 2015, Leap Before You Look, Black Mountain College, 1933 to 1957, a show organized by June 2019 residency speaker Helen Molesworth. The legacy of Black Mountain College is present in many non-traditional art programs, such as our residency-based program here at Lesley. Not only programmatically, but within larger concerns of interdisciplinarity, diversity, collaboration, decentralization of conventional power structures, and the transformation of cultural material into art. These themes, incidentally, are often reemerge in exhibitions Ruth has curated. In a time such as this one, where we often find elements of the once familiar dispersed from the center to the margins, many of the artists in Ruth exhibitions show us how to successfully navigate with sincerity, integrity, and capacity from those margins. They show us how to empower ourselves as artists and as citizens. Ruth Erickson is the Mannion Family Curator at the ICA Boston, where she has worked since 2014. Her ICA projects have included a survey of Mark Dion's work in 2017, solo shows with the artists Kevin Beasley, Ethan Murrow, Wangechi Mutu, Tschabalala Self, Vivian Suter, and the group exhibition When Home Won't Let You Stay, Migration Through Contemporary Art. Her current projects include a contemporary painting exhibition that considers ideas of intimacy and a historical survey on childhood. She has presented and published her work widely, from venues from the Jeu de Paume in Paris, the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, and the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, to publications such as Art in America, Framework, and Critical Landscapes. Ruth received a PhD in art history from the University of Pennsylvania in 2014, where her dissertation looked at radical interdisciplinary art collectives working in France after May 1968. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Erickson.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute there for a moment. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks so much also to Rebecca and the team at Lesley MFA, as well as the students in the program for giving me this time and space tonight to share some of my curatorial research. The low residency MFA program at Lesley in these series of annual talks are always just so greatly enrich the arts landscape in Boston and in Cambridge. And I'm really grateful for these outlets. I'm really humbled to be able to be part of such a star-studded cast of speakers this week. So thanks so much for inviting me. With the school context in mind, I decided not to talk about something that is finished, but rather something that is in process tonight, and that I've been really working on in fits and starts for a long time. You know, curatorial projects, I think, have all kinds of gestation periods, often dictated by institutional timelines, but also by the contours of an exhibition, by the intricacies of loans, or by the ability to sort of pin down ever-propagating thoughts and ideas. And I think this inspiration for this project I'm going to share tonight came out of my personal experience of becoming a mother and raising a child, now two, children. And I think, curators derive their projects from all kinds of different places. I think for me, I've really found that the most sustaining projects are those that have deep connections to my personal life and to our lives, especially I think when those lives are undergoing a really radical transformation. So I want to start with a little anecdote. When I brought my first son to meet my 90-year-old grandmother, she made a kind of offhand comment that spurred me down a path of research. She said, "You modern parents sure give your kids a lot of choices." And, everything I was reading at the time as I was becoming a parent was suffused with models of empowerment and agency, from child psychology to early childhood education to advice received on the playground and from the pediatrician that we saw. This belief, I think, that we seek to enfranchise children as means to build self-worth and build resilience. This is why I asked, did you want this or this for snack? Or what piece of clothing did you want to put on first? I felt that in choice, there was some kind of modicum of self-determination, and a better and stronger person would grow. So this comment really stuck with me. And as I kind of muddled through those early years of parenthood, the words of my grandmother really echoed in my head. And I began fascinated by how models of childhood and parenthood have evolved over time, and how those kind of pre-adolescent years of human life are defined in different places and different times. I think the stakes of this project really became clearer to me as we are renegotiating power regimes on so many different levels, as far as race and gender, sexuality, ability, wealth, and so forth. And I sort of was asking myself, well, so too must we interrogate power in relationship to children, especially as parents. If we can't come up with new systems of organizing our own family, or assuring that our boys are feminists, or taking equality and equity inside our four walls, then how are we supposed to do this work out in the world? So this project, which is both an exhibition and a book and a kind of ongoing research endeavor, really considers how artists have generated visions of childhood through their artwork and within a larger history of ideas about childhood. And I just want to acknowledge here how this project has been supported and advanced through so many conversations and gifts of ideas and time and resources. And I want to especially call out the support that I've gotten from the Institute of Contemporary Art, where I've been a curator since 2014, and from Jeffrey DeBloy, Juan Omar Rodriguez, and Annie Pulagura, who are colleagues at the ICA and whose works and discoveries really make their marks kind of throughout this project. So I thought what would be interesting to share this evening is a series of snapshots of kind of select artists or artworks or case studies that have really been pivotal to my thinking about the project. And in each way, sort of, I see each one as a kind of like prism that really allows you, in this kind of white light of childhood, it allows you to see the kind of spectrum of color. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I'll begin with one of the anecdotes that I found early in my reading. And in this case, it was in a book by the art historian Jonathan Feinberg called The Innocent Eye. In 1902, Paul Klee's sister, Matilda, sent him some of his childhood drawings from the family's home in Bern, Switzerland. So this is one of those. A student at the time, Klee had just returned from studying in Rome, and he was really eager to find new means to break with tradition and convention, to kind of invent new forms. And he received these drawings like a shock, because in them he found an expressiveness that he'd really been searching for. So many other modernist artists were also interested in children's art. Pablo Picasso, Kandinsky, Jean Dubuffet, Juan Murrow, Asger Jorn, Carol Apple, and all of these individuals that I just mentioned amassed collections of children's art. And many of them are sort of united in sharing in a sort of desire to discover prototypes for the human creative impulse. And I think, this fanaticism for the childlike is accompanied by these same artists' interest in, as we know, arts from parts of Africa, Oceania, and Iberia, as well as in folk art. Primitivism is the art historical term that has been used to describe this widespread interest among white European and American modernist artists in art from non-Western cultures, and they're borrowing from those cultures for their own work and aesthetics. I think often these influences are sort of lumped together. So, when the art historian Hal Foster, for instance, introduces a triangulation in modernism between the art of the primitives, children, and the mentally ill, he refers to this triangulation as, quote, a trio of exotics. The examples of this sort of go on. Recently, in Lynn Cook's really amazing exhibition Outliers, which was a project that was very influential to this one, she writes in the introduction, quote, "By the end of World War I, the American avant-garde were following the lead of their European counterparts, mining the art of modernism's others, variously identified as the art of psychotics, naives, children, and the folk," end quote. So what really struck me as I got into this material is what about the differences among and between these lists? What kinds of ideas and feelings are attached to children and found in their artistic output that are different from folk artists and different from Dogon mask carvers or Inuit craftspeople or from the incarcerated people who are dealing with mental illness? And so one of the kind of differences that I became interested in is this dynamic of the other, as it operates between, let's say, a Western male artist perspective and these groups. So I think the child is both other and self. It's a state that we all once were, and yet it is strange and foreign to the adult artist. And I think that the child proposes a kind of proximity that troubles this distancing inherent in the other. And so there's this double-edged quality that I think is part of the reason that childhood has not been as easily interrogated by art historians as other kinds of appropriations. And yet also it remains such a kind of abiding interest for artists. So certainly this proximity is what led Clay to receive his childhood drawings with such a shock and to really start his, with great focus, his study and collection of children's drawings, including those of his son Felix, such as in the center, as well as those of other children, such as on the right. And Clay was also a father, and one of his and Felix's most sustained forms of play were with these great puppets that Clay made. And they would play within this kind of makeshift theater in the corner of their home. They made 50 of these hand puppets, including here you can see on the left a portrait of Clay, this kind of archetype of the big-eared clown, these really kind of creative ways. And in Clay, we also see this being carried forward in his approach later in life to a more kind of schematic approach to mark making, where this sort of rudimentary stick figure forms and other simple lines really come to dominate his work. So I think the idea of childhood creativity and children's art were, really important and yet rarely acknowledged in the development of European modernist art and its aesthetics. The child as primitive, the dream life of children were ideas that really mixed and merged in the minds of many artists who populate our art history books. And as I, began thinking about this and reading more, in many ways, the template of a modern artist, and I should say here, I think it's a white male modernist artist, is really cast from some of the same qualities that we attach to children. There's this idea of unbridled creativity, of playfulness, resistance to social codes, embodying a sense of freedom, and this really complex dynamic between power and powerlessness, which I'll talk about more. So with this kind of snapshot from the early 20th century, from European art history, it compelled my inquiry along two questions. First was, where had artists' abiding interest in childhood led them, and how had it informed their work? And then second, if the child is a kind of touchstone for seeing the world as it really is, then what can we see? So it has appeared to me that every artwork in some way contains within it multiple visions of childhood that reflect the subject's kind of double-edged nature as both a state of human development and as a culturally and politically inflected idea, or said differently, actual children and the construction of childhood, or the idea of childhood. And I think we need to look no further to see this dynamic at work than to think about figurative sculptures of children. So many of you may have had the experience of coming upon one of Dwayne Hansen's sculptures in a museum. It can often be a startling experience. Hansen is an artist who began making sculpture and installations in the late 1960s and 70s, really at that time kind of working against the dominant trends of abstraction and minimalism, choosing instead to kind of concentrate with a almost sociological or an anthropological precision on the kind of life of his subjects who he was constructing. Writing in 1981, Hansen had this quote where he said, "I'm mostly interested in the human form as subject matter and means of expression for my sculpture. What can generate more interest, fascination, beauty, ugliness, joy, shock, or contempt than a human being?" So indeed, one of the sort of most spirited lines of dialogue about his work is how viewers negotiate the space between their own bodies and their own understanding of themselves and Hansen's representations of others. And these debates have circled especially around questions of social class, American culture, gender, aging, nostalgia even. But rarely have they asked how viewers negotiate perception and power in relationship to his sculptures of children, of which there are many. And I think, this really helps to reveal what we as adult viewers, sort of how we construct childhood. So let me take an example. This is Child with Puzzle from 1978. It depicts a young child sitting on a small Persian rug with her gaze downward, looking at a partially finished jigsaw puzzle. It's actually a sculpture of Hansen's own daughter, Maya, and that is cast from her body and then recreated in resins and polyvinyl. The scene in some ways is so familiar and so packed full of these perfectly selected details and colors and textures that in some ways it kind of can be read almost instantaneously. We see a young girl, her pink dress tied with these limp bows over her shoulders, her long hair pulled back, her skin is peach, her pose is relaxed, the rug suggests she is at home. I think many of these parts of the sculpture, the private sphere, her femaleness and whiteness, really confirm her apparent innocence as a child. She is engrossed in her puzzle. She's kind of in a state of absorption or detachment. She's playing. She seems to be unaware of us. And I think by the size of our bodies, there would be a sense of sort of, standing over her by virtue of our size and her pose, or as we move through a museum where this would be viewed. And I think this fact of scale combined with all of these other observations really set up a particular dynamic of power, of possession on the one hand, yes, but also of distance and of being kind of outside her sphere of interest, of being sort of compelled not to disturb her. And it's often, it's often the sort of specificity, the sort of like ludicrously close attention that Hansen pays to every detail in his sculptures that makes the work really quite so appealing. But I think that also operating here, we see the sense of the archetype of a kind of universal mode of being or idea that is reconfigured over and over again across time, across geography, across culture. And I feel like this work really shows how these two are so closely linked in childhood, how the image of childhood play, of innocence, of disempowerment appears again and again. It really becomes this kind of archetype of a certain raced, classed, and gendered childhood. And I'd say that it has been consistent, since at least the Victorian era, this period when historians locate the start of a modern understanding of childhood as a kind of distinct period of human development. So as I began to look for other sculptures of children, and I found many, often cast from the bodies of actual children, I really became fascinated by the gaps that existed between, the child and the image of childhood being formed, and the ways that artists have found really creative inspiration to intervene in that space. So I've already spoken about artists' interests in children's drawings in the first part of the 20th century, but that fascination has really continued. And indeed, this kind of untutored, expressive kind of mark making, I think in many ways has become a trademark of modern and contemporary art, from Paul Klee to Jackson Pollock, Cy Twombly, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Amy Sillman. And these approaches to mark making have been linked to various references to classical antiquity, to graffiti, abstraction, and many other cultural references. But it's really rare to find a reference to children's drawings. And I think that's perhaps partly because they are less culturally approved sources of inspiration. Children's drawings are often relegated to the space of the vernacular, to common culture, to things parents admire, they hang on their refrigerators, or they feel compelled to hang on their refrigerators, not really objects of serious study. There have been some exceptions, and one of the most notable that I've come across in my research is the San Francisco-based early childhood educator Rhoda Kellogg, who collected more than 2 million drawings. Sorry, the chat just popped up. I thought it was for me. So Rhoda Kellogg here, she collected more than 2 million drawings by children beginning in the 1940s, a selection of which, a small selection can be seen here. And I came to learn about Kellogg through a contemporary artist named Brian Ballot, who has mounted exhibitions of and devoted a significant amount of time to her amazing archive and her books and her theorization of children's mental and artistic development from infancy. So, it's not that we haven't looked at children's drawings. Indeed, we all have. But I would say that we've, looked past them. We've taken them in some ways as emblematic of a stage of development rather than fully formed in their own right. And even the early modernists, who were such fans of children's art, took it largely as unmediated expressions. And I would say that it proves to just be so much more than that. A line is the first kind of mark a young child is able to make. It's the building block of written expression, of drawing, and it's also incredibly complex. A single line tells us so much about, through its width and its direction, its curvature, its length, all kinds of other qualities. What tools were used? How does it relate to pattern and shape? What does it suggest about the body's posture or the hand's pressure? And it was really in looking at the photographs of an American photographer named Helen Levitt. Trying to go forward here. Let's see. There we go. That I began to sort of see some of the ways that these drawings were operating in other ways, operating in sort of new ways that I hadn't thought of. So beginning in the 30s, Levitt frequently turned her lens on children playing in New York. These are some of her most kind of iconic photographs, and really capturing the kind of dynamism of that environment as well as the play life of children. And among her body of work are more than 150 drawings of sidewalk chalk drawings. And they really show us the kind of countless possibilities of, what drawing like a child might mean or might suggest. It might mean blocky forms or varying thicknesses of line or distortions or symbols and so forth. And while Levitt in her drawings tended to center the drawing itself, I became really interested in sort of what's happening on the periphery, what's happening through these interactions, what's happening outside of the drawing, to think about how the drawings are actually operating. So, looking at the photographs alongside photographs of children, the drawings I started thinking of them as sort of sites of performance and interaction, or as means to negotiate social space or to share, as acts of self-understanding, ways to understand the world around the child, to insert oneself into it or to protect oneself from it. These are not unmediated creations, but I started to really see and understand those chalk drawings as channels between children, their imaginations, and the conceptions of childhood that are sort of thrust upon them. And I think in the public act of drawing on a sidewalk, the children are really actively participating in both performing and recording ideas of childhood, and reading and modifying the scripts that are offered to them through society. And I just have to say here that it was at the same time of learning about Helen Levitt's work that I was reading some of the work that Robin Bernstein, who's at Harvard, especially this book, Racial Innocence, wrote. And it was really her methodology in thinking about this relationship between children and the scripts of childhood that became very influential to my thinking here. So child's imaginative play space, their belief in magic and mystery, their animation of the inanimate, you know, this creation of this button here that you might press it to go into a secret passage. This whole kind of world is such a powerful inspiration for many artists. And many artists, contemporary living artists, when I ask them, why are you interested in childhood? It's because of this sense of enchantment. And I think one sort of area that I became really interested in was thinking about children's literature and books and the ways in which storytelling and illustration participate in forming worldviews and of sort of imagining one's emotional and psychological self. And, you know, artists have been involved in children's literature in really countless ways. One of the objects that I became especially intrigued by, and I think one of the kind of, oh, here's another one of Helen Levitt's great photographs, sorry. Are these story quilts by Faith Ringgold. And, you know, Ringgold began making her story quilts in the 1980s through a collaboration with her mother, Willie Jones, a fashion designer and a dressmaker. And previously, Ringgold had been making these expressive paintings. And I think it was interesting to sort of think about this turn to the quilts as part of her, you know, engagement, ongoing engagement with a feminist art practice. And these really, you know, meticulously crafted quilts carry on much of her pioneering work in painting. Speaking about her sources, for the quilts, she said, quote, "I paint from my experience. This is what I know. I am not a man or European, and I wanted to learn and express the lives of my sex and people, not others. So it is important to me to include my people in the conversation." So all of the narrators of Ringgold's quilts are Black women whose stories and voices recount really rich narratives, seeking to overturn stereotypical depictions. So sort of, there's an amazing body of story quilts, of which I'm just skimming the surface here, but zeroing is women on a Bridge. This work became the inspiration for an award-winning children's books. So here what you're seeing is a combination of acrylic painted text and image on a quilted surface. The work has this central scene depicting neighbors dining on a flat roof of a building in New York City with the George Washington Bridge in the distance. And Cassie Louise Lightfoot is the spirited 8-year-old narrator and heroine who is lying with her younger brother on a mattress or a blanket in the lower right. And she explains, and this is written in the text, quote, "Sleeping on Tar Beach was magical. Laying on the roof in the night with stars and skyscraper buildings all around me made me feel rich, like I owned all I could see. The bridge was my prized possession." So in the story, she gains possession over the city by alighting into flight. And another part, the sort of text reads, "Only 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, and I can fly. That means I'm free to go wherever I want for the rest of my life." And throughout the story, which is recounted and imaged through this quilt, the bridge, which, you know, named for the first US president, and other buildings are described as these sort of sites of her father's labor and his sometimes unemployment and hardship. And in many ways, the bridge kind of becomes this masculine icon. So for her to then describe the bridge as her possession is this amazing assertion of her power over the patriarchy. The bridge, you know, she talks about at one point, the bridge becoming her glittering diamond that she wears. So Ringgold in this piece kind of introduces this twin subject matter of childhood imagination and female liberation through this idea of taking flight. And I think what's incredible is the child narrator is very aware of the socioeconomic constraints of her existence. And she uses the rooftop as this kind of springboard to leisure, to escape, to a beach, to magical abilities, and to different circumstances. And it's really this, you know, incredible object with the complexities in thinking about children narrators and children as audiences. And I think, you know, and through this book and images, you know, these are made available to any child reader who would go to their local library and pick up this award-winning book. So the liberation that I evoke in thinking about children and freedom, which are so often entertained, they're kind of anchored in a very unspecified future. children in childhood are so often linked to the future, in common kind of parlance. It's sort of an optimistic move that I think we associate the kind of resolution of current problems with the future actions of our children. The art historian Anne Higonnet has put it really well. She said, "The subject of childhood is essentially the subject of how we form and value our collective future." And I think one can see kind of immediately the dilemma of this peculiar position of being freighted with the future and the ways in which kind of hope or optimism in children become an excuse for inaction in the present. I think on the other hand, childhood for many adults is a space of great nostalgia, was sort of filled with a better time in the past or really complex and difficult events of their own children. And all of these kind of adult projections related to time, whether or not it be future or the past, are made onto individuals whose own understanding of time as children develop is still very much in process. So I became really interested in this overlapping of time in relationship to the subject of childhood and the understanding of children. And I started to see the work of an incredible artist named Angelica akuneli Crosby, who's a great painter, born in Lagos, based in LA, and really one of the most important painters of her generation. And much of the writing about Crosby's work really focuses on her transcultural biography. It describes and talks a lot about her use of her personal and found photographs and the ways that she mixes and combines those using this photo transfer process to create a kind of final work that is this kind of syncretic mixing of diaspora and diasporic experiences. Families and children and siblings are really quite common in her work, often her own family. And in 2014, she began this series called The Beautiful Ones, which is comprised of portraits of Nigerian children that are derived from personal photographs and from images that she took when she would travel back to visit Nigeria. And the title of the series comes from a novel that was published in 1968. And the full title of the novel is The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And this story tells a story of a man who works at a railway and struggles with the kind of reality of a recently independent Ghana. So it's written, right after Ghana gained independence. And so I think it's interesting, invoking this title, Crosby links her project back to a post-colonial project of many West African countries, who also then linked a kind of national identity and newly born national identity to children as a sort of future of a self-governing nation. So in thinking about this kind of framework of that novel and the evocation of children within sort of post-colonial imaginations and realities, it's interesting to then sort of hone down and look at what Crosby does with that sort of frame. Her series is titled The Beautiful Ones. And, we read these as portraits. Many, I think all of the figures in this are looking out at the viewer. They are the beautiful ones. They are really self-possessed. They have brown skin. They're confident. They are the people, who learn, who care for their siblings, who go about their lives, who are there, who are present. And yet this sort of presence, this child that's depicted, the present as in the time that's depicted, is really part of an incredibly complex image ground that comprises hundreds of images. Some of them are discernible, some of them are just color and textures. And if you look closely, you can see domestic scenes, you see street scenes, traces of how social and personal history shape and build up the individual. Some of them are drawn from Crosby's own family photo albums, and you'll also find historical and contemporary images, pop culture icons, gestures, details. Really, it's an incredible array of ground that she sort of builds up. And any single image is specific, but together they sort of reflect this amazing tapestry of which the child pictures is both part of it, but also stands apart from it. And, for me, Crosby's paintings really encapsulate a kind of co-production between socio-historical conditions and the individual that is at the heart of human development. The children are sort of formed by the world and they form the world. And this co-production happens through the overlapping of spaces and times, of generations in ancestry, the present, and certainly the future yet to be seen. So as I mentioned at the start of this project, it happened alongside my experience of becoming a mother, of surviving as a mother. And it often pushed up against the boundaries of motherhood as I understood it. I always knew when I started on this project that care and caretaking, reproductive labor would be a part of it because they're such a sort of vital part of children's survival. But I did not anticipate some of the amazing writing and thinking about the politics and ethics of care that are happening right now across disciplines. So one passage I came across, which is on the screen, was this quote by Hilton Als from when he was being recognized by the Brooklyn-based journal Triple Canopy. And he says, "What the discipline of care gives us is an ability to relate to others while not negating others. Those others with all those stories. Those others who are not us, but who are as responsible for our care as we are for theirs. This has nothing to do with borders or sanctions, but the extended hand and the ear bent in the hard work of understanding." So I read this when I was on the Amtrak train headed to New York to see the Kathy Wilkes survey at PS1. And I jotted it down in my notebook. And a few hours later, I saw this work by Wilkes. And it was one of those moments where art just pierces you to your core. It just pierced me right to my heart. And in this tableau, this installation, the figures are really simply constructed from pieces of fabric. They're stitched together with stuffing. They're paper mache heads. Their attachment and their kind of ability to be whole, seems as fragile as the existence that is captured. And the details of this tableau are just amazing. The porcelain basin and the tub sort of spoke to me about daily use and of toil, as does this labor where it looks like the standing figure seems to be like washing these strips of fabric. There's this rusted xylophone, a child's toy, that gestures to play and to music. And the three figures, perhaps a family unit, perform the unmistakable roles of reproductive labor, of need, of fulfilling those needs, of playing despite those needs, and of seemingly contending with a world over which they have very little control and perhaps only partly understand. And I was so obsessed in particular with this gesture, with this pose of the bent form and the extended hand, this act of touch. It just held so much for me, attention, responsiveness, like dignity, degradation, putting one's needs ahead of your own, caring as helping the other to grow, touch as a way of communicating and reaffirming connectedness and sort of testing the reality of the world. So zooming back out to Wilkes' practice sort of more broadly, her charged arrangements of commonplace items and personal artifacts, they come across as very open-ended and kind of charged. I think they're about everyday situations and about the marginalization of everyday experience. I think her scenes often depict what we read as the downtrodden or the voiceless or the dispossessed, and the child is a really common figure in her work. And in thinking about sort of why this work touched me so much, it wasn't that I was only identifying in this work with the bent mother figure, but I felt like I was also identifying with the infant child. And the discipline of care is not the province of mothers, though its distribution is almost always uneven in terms of gender and race and economics. Motherhood might be better understood as a possible action or a function that can be shared and doesn't need to be limited to a single person, but in fact works better when it's reciprocal. And there's been really just amazing work, I think, on the idea of motherhood as a function, as a sort of distribution, rather than being associated with a single person. It's been much harder to find artworks that represent or express an expanded motherhood function, the caretaking of siblings, fathers, domestic workers, foster parents, extended family, teachers, healers, but the work is happening. You know, we're really invested in expanding out through these images of gestures of care and trying to imagine within the exhibition, mothering as a collective project that I think really foregrounds the practical and intangible needs of those whose survival is most threatened in their community. So this idea of this kind of distributed function that is more horizontal in form is, you know, part of so many progressive efforts, as well as pedagogical models from John Dewey forward. And it's one of the sources of inspiration for a project by Oscar Murillo called Frequencies. This project came across our radar pretty early in our research. It was included in the late Okwueunwezor's 2015 Venice Biennale, which is pictured here. And it's really been at the center of how we envision this exhibition ending. So working with the sociologist Clara Dublanc, Murillo and volunteers initiate this project in schools. And what they do is they affix a blank canvas to the desk of a student who is between the ages of 10 and 16, and they leave it in place for 6 months. And so far, the team has installed canvases at more than 300 schools in 31 countries, including some really large-scale recent projects in India and in China. And the archive that the artist is collecting now numbers more than 25,000 individual canvases in its sort of archive. The installations of these canvases always includes different parts of the world. And Oscar has talked about kind of connecting frequencies from these distinct parts of the world. Now, when the canvases are installed, there are no directions or drawing tools given to the students. So it's, I think in the concept of the project, it's kind of this blank space, a sort of a modernist nod inserted into the school environment, and this social experiment unfolds. Some canvases come back nearly blank. You know, perhaps they just have the yellowed patina of touch, the faint outline of a laptop that sat on top of it, but most are filled really edge to edge with marks and writings. Some of the marks are discernible in the writing, some aren't, but all of them are sort of, for me, filled with these two kind of discordant senses of, on the one hand, a kind of immediacy, and on the other hand, a kind of ennui, this, you know, sort of boredom. And one of the kind of central tensions, I think, in this project is the relationship between a kind of open or empty, unintentional space, a sort of free zone, in relationship to the institution of the school, where lessons and rules and socialization really reign. You know, even the desk itself, if you think about it as kind of the underlying support, you know, is in so ways the object that facilitates focus and discipline for the student. And so, you know, each canvas contains this tension between a sort of freedom of the marks and the rigid shape of the desk. Or the diversity of the students and the fixed form of the system. Speaking about the project, Oscar has described, I'll include a quote here, he described, quote, "Children, I believe, still have that tug of war between challenging the system and going through a system that at the end will indoctrinate them into our society, but they're not quite part of the system yet," end quote. You know, and so I think in some ways, in thinking about ending the exhibition with this project, we sort of are near at the start again. We're back with children's mark making, you know, a line on a surface that's made between lessons, perhaps for no reason, but to make it, but also in a way to acknowledge one's presence and construct oneself. And for me, I think Murillo's archive really captures the fact that in looking at these canvases, you know, you come to realize, or it's really acknowledged, that there is not one childhood, but there's in fact countless childhoods. So I shared a sort of handful of artworks here because I wanted to offer some of the sort of footholds for my interest, the things that help to propel me to the next artist, the next object, the next question. And there are really so many more amazing artists and artworks. And I really hope that everybody listening will be able to see the final exhibition or read the book once we're done. this project in so many ways is also my life. It knits together the things that are most dear to me, children and art, and it finds within them these really deep resonances. And in preparing for this curatorial research talk, I actually looked back in the notebooks that I keep for each project. I have 3 now for this project. And I found this very first notes that are actually stapled into the book because it was before this project had a dedicated book. And they're actually from a talk that Anna Craycroft gave at this very program in 2015. Anna's an amazing artist and thinker who has worked on themes of pedagogy and childhood for a long time. And so, I just wanted to sort of give a snapshot of this to say that I really hope that, especially to the students, soak up everything, process, cogitate, keep on doing the important work of making.
Thank you, Ruth. Can we all unmute and give Ruth a round of applause? Thank you. So please put your questions, and we have so many art teachers in our program, so I'm really curious to hear what the art teachers have to say here. But I had a couple questions I wanted to kind of get things started with, Ruth. I'm really fascinated with your kind of research methodology, because there's one element which is written towards the book and the publication, and the other towards the exhibition. But I'm curious, how does one influence the other? Like if that Dwayne Hansen sculpture is not available, for example, for exhibition, do you then have to find a similar one, or do you just branch off into a different area? Because I imagine a lot of the work, much like with artists, there are a lot of sort of productive constraints that might push you to into one realm of effort in away from another. So I was hoping you can address that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like you survive by necessity. I don't know if there's a sort of grand plan for how the research methodology or the research happens. I think for myself, this project, I think especially for curators, there's this toggle between the sort of the space of the exhibition and the objects that are gonna convey most strongly to who you imagine your audience being, between sort of the ideas and the writing and the reading. And I think that, I came to curating through art history, and I got my PhD in art history, and I sort of came to it through books and ideas. And I think early on, especially as a curator, that was very much, I was kind of like writing an essay in space, is this phrase that's often used. But I think that I've sort of learned that in some ways they're 2 different objects, and they're 2 different beasts, and the research in a way can sort of feed into all of it, because I think the research is sort of the cloud. But the exhibition making for me is really about the most compelling artwork and how that artwork can carry forward and give over to an audience, sort of convey these complex but also communicate messages. Like I need artworks that communicate. And then I think that the book is a space where you can do other things. It's in some ways a different audience. It's a much more kind of long-term durational. I think you can sometimes bring in other scholarly voices, archival materials. Some people love archival materials in exhibitions. I think many people, as I watch them walk through the museum, breeze past archival materials. So I'm somebody who would probably put those archival materials in the book, in the textual place, and I would bring forward, that Dwayne Hansen sculpture. I also, I've learned you can't get overly attached to a single object. I mean, all of these that I shared tonight are all works that are right now in our exhibition, and we plan to have there, and I really hope they are. They're my anchors in a lot of ways. But, objects fall out, and sometimes loans don't come through, and you have to find something else. And there's, so much art out there. So I guess it's sort of is a toggle between the 2, but I would say I'm most struck by the ways in which I see the book and the exhibition as quite distinct forms. And I think that with somewhat distinct audiences as well. So that means that how I write, or how I think about constructing those objects are made differently for those different audiences.
Great. And I guess my second question is sort of the kind of rise of childhood as a form. You know, I just remember a joke by Jerry Seinfeld. He's like, you know, when my children go to bed, it's like the coronation of the Pope, like all these, you know, special, it's got to be the right doll and the right lighting and the right this and the right that. And he goes, you know what my, you know, childhood, you know what my bedtime story was? Darkness, right? And it was just this complete lack of sort of understanding of his lived life as a child. He's just sort of part of the family. And I think about my own parents and certainly my mother, who's from Asia, you know, there was no recognition of her experience as a child. And I'm wondering how in your research that has sort of, you know, maybe risen as a kind of subject by itself and not a kind of side effect or something else, but something that is worthy of direct attention in a new way, I suppose.
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer it. And certainly the kind of like there's a book by an author named Philip Ardiers, which is very important, which makes an important kind of early argument where he tracks from, I think it's like pre-medieval up to the present of sort of how this idea of childhood is constructed and thought about in different times. And I would say that, you know, almost any sort of academic text you read about the history of childhood, it cites his book and it cites the kind of creation of the modern idea of childhood. And, you know, it's a very much a Western history, European Western history in his book. So I think that the way to answer that, there's so many different ways, I think in different places, even within, if you're just focusing on like American culture, even different, you know, social classes, economics are such a huge factor in the ways in which childhood is experienced and I think understood. So I would, you know, there's both like a kind of long history. And I think that book by Ardiers, who actually Dan Byers, a local curator, actually sent me that book that he found it, I think in Maine. And it was such a kind of important text. So there is sort of a history of how this idea within the West, at least, is constructed. It's very much tied to an idea, a moment in which the child becomes differentiated from the adult, and that there is not a sort of the child as just an early kind of poor stage of adulthood, but in fact, it's something that is distinctly its own. And he attaches that to sort of a post-Enlightenment moment. But then I think, you know, if you start kind of bearing down and looking even, you know, quite locally, even, you know, and how childhood is being experienced so vastly different during this pandemic by different people, depending upon what the specific arrangement is and the kind of measures of safety, of healthcare literacy, of, you know, how one's parents or caretakers are employed. So it's sort of like, I feel like you can get so granular where it almost becomes difficult to even see what the contours of, you know, a childhood might be. But what you're describing of this sort of exalted, or there's this great phrase that's used in like pop kind of writing about childhood, of the child tyrant, you know, that this new sort of child who is actually like calling all the shots in the family and needs that very specific sort of environment. And, you know, I think partly I feel like that has to be an effect of our commercial culture and of capitalism and of the kind of commodification of both parenthood and childhood and the sort of like gadgets that we fill our rooms with. I mean, in my house right now, everybody sleeps with a freaking sound machine on, you know, and it's like, so I think that then there's sort of an effect, I think, especially of this commodification that has furthered the sort of specialization of, you know, of childhood and how we are sort of surviving it.
Oh, interesting. I see a number of questions in the chat. And so I'm going to start with Tara and then go to John Fall.
Oh, hi, Ruth. That was really great. I enjoyed it very much as a mother. And I was thinking about there's like these two arcs happening where your 90-year-old grandmother was talking about, oh, you know, you give them so many choices today. And then also there's this arc of how children are like collected or sort of captured into plaster casting, and sort of this arc of then how children can start making their marks in being seen in the art world. And as a mother, sometimes it seems so, I feel like we're just on the cusp of children informing more and informing up. like as an artist, when my daughter was little, like I was just like tracing her work into my drawings just to get a sense of, well, what does that feel like, or what is she doing? But I never really was making work with her, you know, and now that time has passed. But she used to be part of this lab group at the University of Washington here. I live in Seattle. And so she was in the information school and co-designing technology with grad students and faculty. And the kids were like, oh no, it needs to be like this. And they're like, have Post-it notes and craft paper. And they're saying, oh, this system of like, to build like an animation program for kids who are illiterate or speak a different language or read a different language, it should be this way. And then the grad students would say, okay. And then they do something, they come back and they were like developing this together. And so I'm thinking maybe that's like the next stage in the art world, you know, because those pieces on the desk are still kind of passive, but it's experimental. Like, well, what are these kids going to do? What kind of marks are they going to do? But I just like wonder, like 40 years from now in the museum, are we going to be seeing things that parents or artists co-design with children? Certainly there's like social practice, but sometimes it's like community based, or it's not like that kid specific. So anyways.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're saying kind of gets at this, and we have there are a few projects in the exhibition that sort of touch on collaboration and the sort of the possibilities and the tricky dynamics of collaboration when the partners are, for all circumstances, not equals, you know, and a desire to overcome that inequality and the possibilities of kind of overcoming it, but also it always tends to like reassert itself in these attempts at collaboration between adults and children, let's just say. But we have there, you know, there's a lot of interesting examples of artists kind of more directly collaborating with their children. And many artists have also kind of, like you just described maybe with their own children, like a desire to do so, but finding it really hard to figure out how to like harness that where you weren't just like co-opting or overriding, you know, what they were doing, and what is that dynamic of, you know, what that collaboration really looks like. I mean, one good example of somebody who's not in our show, but whose work I really like is Wendy Redstar, who, I don't know, you know, she has this really amazing collaboration. She just did a big project at Mass MoCA with her daughter. And I think the ways in which that has been set up, and, you know, she's married to Harold Fletcher, who has done this work. I think they might be in Portland or Seattle, who's done this work with these interviews of children. And so I think both of them are sort of have put forward models of collaboration that feel to me, you know, like they're really getting at something where they're kind of able to have the input, and it feels a little bit more like an authentic collaboration. And the other, you know, collective in Toronto, Mammalian Diving Reflex, is a collective who did a lot of performances with children. They did this great project called Haircuts, Haircuts by Children, where children were sort of taught by stylists how to do haircuts. I think they were 8 to 10-year-olds, and then people would line up to get their haircuts by children. And they also have an entire kind of pedagogy of the ways in which they've developed some of their programs and some of their programs with teens. And I say too there, it's like, there's this edge that some projects hit and some don't, between how you're negotiating the sense of kind of like input and overriding or something is how I want to say it right now. So those are just some examples that come to mind of places where I feel like that collaboration sort of has the right balance, but I think it's a really tricky one to hit.
Yes, in the lab group that she was in, a lot of the papers that are coming out is just studying how to collaborate with children and you know, best practices. But it was really interesting to see what knowledge and wisdom that they had. I mean, in one project they were working with Alexa, and they found, you know, children will ask Alexa, will you kill me in my sleep? And Alexa said, oh, I don't know, or maybe. So there's something there. I think they have that. We do need to listen to children. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, John, you had a question? It's possible John is not with us right now. So a number of you have comments in the chat. I didn't know. I see Catlin, I see Craig, Rachel, and Aaron, and Holly. And I don't know how many of you want to turn that into a question.
I have a question. So I'm curious about these ideas about powerlessness, and this idea of like children being sort of the custodians of a redemptive future, and sort of how unfair that is. And, you know, in looking at the piece, The Girl with the Puzzle, or even with the piece with the gesture of nose blowing, but to me it looks like suffocation. You know, I feel like there's this weird, I mean, maybe that's like a hyper personal read, but like I don't know if that's real, but there seems to me this tremendous tension and sort of like irrationality and hopelessness of that gesture if and maybe in my imagination that the child, because of this, is then unprepared to fulfill that redemption, given the imposition of that responsibility.
Which piece are you talking about with the suffocation?
I'm sorry, the pink forms with the guy washing the clothes.
Oh yeah,
and then the blowing the nose. I know it's not, I guess, not supposed to read as suffocation.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, that's interesting. Yeah.
But I was just wondering what like, as you were researching this, like, was there like some sort of thought about like the innate powerlessness of children, and like sort of how, especially thinking about like Western cultural narratives and like how everyone's doing in the pandemic, you know, sort of how that primes them for this sort of horrible understanding. Do you kind of like, I don't really know how to articulate that as a question, but it's more of an observation. I wonder how you respond to that or what you think about that. I don't know.
I mean, I think you said a couple things. I mean, one, sort of that unfairness of the redemptive future, you know, and I think, I mean, think how common it is to like, I feel like I like got a mailing today that said like, you know, children are our future, you know, like give money. So like, it's such a common trope, and it's true. They will be alive after I'm dead, you know, and yet there's such a kind of imposition, I think, on that to sort of a sort of offsetting, you know, of one's own responsibility. And I think it comes up especially around the climate crisis. Like I think of like Greta Thunberg and some of the things that she said, you know, and thinking about like, what are you leaving us with? Like, you know, why this is something that needs to be fixed now, not something to sort of think, you know, that our children will fix. So I think the sort of that relationship between sort of future and I think the pressures of that and the realities of that are, you know, I think that that's in some ways just like true, like it's so tied to that future. The sense of, you know, I'm really interested in, I think the powerlessness thing is a bit like easier to understand in that, you know, children have guardians, you know, there's this UN Declaration of Children's Rights, which I think it's US and maybe Somalia, which are the only two nations that haven't signed it, which is a Declaration of Human Rights for Children. And I think that like it's in some ways, with all of the horrific things that we know that happen in the world, it's easy to understand the powerlessness. And I'm interested in the show to also really convey the power. And I think the sense of, you know, self-possession and knowing what's right and like being able to affect change and be powerful leaders and be voices, you know, within their family or their classroom. Like I'm interested, I think, in a way of conveying that aspect more. And so, you know, in the exhibition, there are no works that are sort of looking at some of the ills that happen to children. I think it's more imagining kind of figurations of children where they are negotiating with, on the one hand, their kind of societal position of lacking certain rights, and on the other hand, finding ways of living and surviving, and of helping others to survive, even from that space of disenfranchisement. So I think that, like, to me, is a little bit, and I think that in some ways that is also what many of the artists that I'm finding and in conversation with are also really focused on.
Thank you so much.
Great. John is back with us, and he has a question, and then Noelle has a question.
Oh no, I can't hear you, John. Can others?
John, you're unmuted. Is your microphone okay?
Hi again.
Oh, we can hear you, but it's not too loud.
Oh,
I can hear
I'll
you.
save the question for a different time.
Oh no, we can hear you now.
It's okay, we can hear you.
The question is, from where do you sense kids make art from that we as adults lose? You know, it seems like the art is so close to an art instinct, to something that is just for them, and then we lose it. And do you have an opinion about, you know, those painters who say they want to paint like a child again?
Yeah, I think that I guess I would say that I don't think children only draw or create from instinct. And I think that this, you know, and I mentioned the art historian Robin Bernstein here, and I think that very early on, children see and understand the ideas and the roles of childhood and the ways in which behavior is modeled. And I think that when children are beginning to, I mean, there's very early scribbling, and there's very early just kind of the mechanics of sort of developmentally being able to make repetitive marks and like create a circle. And I mean, developmental psychologists in the group, like, you know, correct me, because there's obviously a sort of body of understanding of just when and how you can make certain marks. But then I think that, especially around the moment that work becomes figurative and that it becomes narrativized, you know, like children learn how to tell those stories and draw those figures from the things that they're seeing and they're reading and they're hearing. And I think that then the space of the drawing and of the art kind of becomes this negotiation between something that's from their imagination and a kind of figuration that is informed by all kinds of other social and cultural factors. So I think, you know, from my understanding, it sort of very quickly moves in. And that's what I was kind of trying to talk about with the Helen Levitt chalk drawings, is that, you know, I see in those, I think there's all kinds of like mediation and these kind of performances, drawing as a site of understanding one's place in the world and one's own body. So yeah, I think that there's I think that modernist understanding of kind of an unmediated creative action holds very strong in the psyche. But I think that that very quickly has to be sort of understood of something that is participating in the kind of cultural and socio-historical scripts and sort of conditions that children, you know, are part of and are very aware of. And I think that actually happens really early. And I think more and more research in like developmental psychology is kind of pointing to how early some of those understandings of self are forming and how those are informed by the environment. So but I also think that, like, I think I can just speak for myself. You know, I've lost a lot that I associate with children, you know, like playfulness and sort of, you know, even like the belief how often children will animate inanimate things. So, you know, like the fork walks over, and this sense of like belief in the ability of an inanimate thing to be animate and to have a voice and to sort of be a character. I mean, that's totally gone. Like, so, you know, at what point in time does ideas of enchantment and magic and play, you know, begin to dissipate and I think many artists really seek out ways that they can retain that kind of behavior and playfulness. And I think we're all the better for it.
There's a question by Noelle and then one by Eileen.
I really liked Martha's comment there. It's related to my question. But my question is, aside from Rhoda Kellogg, have you had a chance to really delve into sort of the whole pretty rich field of art education, sort of theory and research? You know, like Victor Lowenfeld or Marilyn Zermulin, or you know, Robert Coles wrote on the Call of Stories and the role of narrative and children's art making, which really talks a lot about sort of that interplay between how you construct yourself, or how the self is constructed for a child, and art making. I think the big limitation that you seem to point out is that most of the research is done around drawing. So as an art practitioner, it's really about materials, right? Not just about drawing. But yeah, I was just wondering if you had had a chance to look at any of that sort of whole field of, because I think it's really interesting, the field. I got my degree quite a long time ago, but at that time, the field was really divided between sort of a more discipline-based art kind of an approach to education and teaching and what's important as an art teacher and what's important for your art students, versus more of a phenomenological approach, which is based in experience, sort of like first comes the making, then comes the naming, which is like what Martha's quote is, "I will know what it is when I make it." So, yeah, I mean, that and there's the journal Art and Children. That's a really good journal that's been around for a little while. But yeah, I know that the fields are so separated from each other sometimes. Yeah. When I was in graduate school, when I would take studio classes, one of the professors would just call me art education. Oh, there's art education. Like, it was a little bit derogatory. It's like, yeah, like Coles.
I've done Robert Coles and Lowenfeld are definitely texts that I've engaged with pretty superficially, I would say, but are definitely texts that we've touched on. And then this figure, Victor Demirko, who's worked in MoMA's art education department and really kind of in the 50s did a lot of kind of important writing and thinking about sort of museum audience, children as part of the museum audience, and how museum art education programs and museum education programs could sort of think about children and engaging children. So I've also done quite a bit of work on him, because at one point I was sort of thinking about, or part of the show is definitely thinking about children as one audience of the museum and trying to think through that through the approach to installation and sort of troubling some of the expectations that I think sometimes exhibition designs have around children. So, dropping the height of certain things or putting certain things that might seem not as like appropriate for children at their eye level, and then putting the sort of primary colored objects up higher. So just sort of troubling some of these kind of expectations we have around exhibition design and children. I don't know about the Art and Children Journal, so that's really good to know. I would say that,
Marilyn Zermulin is really good too. She wrote a small book called Art, Praxis, Symbol, and Presence. Yeah. And she talks a lot about that kind of emerging narrative. God, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you. Oh, but the comment of when does this sort of naivete, or that we would tend to generalize as naivete, leave children's art? I mean, Lowenfeld would say that it's the dawn of realism, the gang age, when children become so hyper socially oriented. And then of course their ability to think abstractly, just because of, changes, physiological changes. Yeah,
and I saw somebody popped in the quote here, 9 years old. And that's often like, Ellen Winner is a psychologist at BU, and she's done a lot of really interesting experiments around children's creativity. And yeah, that like cusp of that 8-9-year-old sort of switch seems very to come up a lot in a lot of the psychology around creativity studies that I've read, partly kind of inspired by her work. But I know Lesley has such an amazing art education program, so it's actually a really good idea to try and connect with people there too, to sort of, learn more about that subject matter. I would just want to say the field that I feel like childhood studies, which I don't know how much interaction there is between art education and childhood studies. I think childhood studies is a field that has been rooted a bit more in history and English departments and literature departments, but it's really a field that was born in the 90s. And I have there's a number of journals that are, come out of that field. And there's a lot of kind of self-analysis, like Jeunesse is one of a great journal. And so that's something that I have definitely been sort of getting up to speed on. I didn't study childhood studies at all. I never took a class on it, but it's been interesting to see the debates within that field and to understand them as they make their way through common culture and through kind of artists' work. And I think that one around the question around agency and powerlessness is a really central one to the kind of discussions going on in that field. So I think that has been influential to me as sort of thinking about a field outside of the arts, which is mostly rooted in literature. Thank you.
Eileen, do you have a question about play, I think?
Yeah, I just had you may have touched on this already, but I was just curious if you really looked at the connection between art and play. And a lot of artists talk about that. And that's one of the things that captures them about children. And when you draw with children and you work with them, is that sense of play.
Yeah. There was a great exhibit at the Peabody Essex Museum called Playtime a couple years ago that Trevor did up there. And I know, at the time of him working on that show, we talked a lot about play. So it comes up. And I think I decided in this exhibition not to sort of do a separate section because I felt like play was something that is sort of ever present. And I think it manifests itself in so many different ways in different sort of artists' work. So I thought that it would sort of be like one of those subterraneans that sort of is everywhere and therefore like nowhere, because it is such an important and such a kind of commonly evoked aspect of, of the way of troubling patterns of behavior through play, of this kind of sense of discovery and surprise and excitement and sort of a resistance to a certain kind of system or pattern of a way of being. So that I think is how play often will come up and be evoked by artists. So there's not sort of, I don't call it out specifically, but I think that it is kind of ever present in the project. And I was thinking in part, as far as Playtime, there's been a number of different exhibitions on play. So I also felt like as far as exhibitions, sort of there'd been a great accounting of play that had been done.
Craig, you have a question?
Yeah, so I began with a comment on Oscar Murillo and of that project that you showed, the Desk Project. And I think it's curious because thinking back to the MoMA show and Murillo at that time, it seems like there was a lot of kind of unknowns about him and a loss of faith around his work, and a lot of people questioning, oh, it's just, it's really sort of neo-casualist and he's young and he got a big push and look what he's doing. I think this Desk project adds tremendous credence to his thinking, and it's beautiful, and the results are beautiful, and interesting. How those turn into objects too. My question is about the exhibit. It seems like by framing this exhibit, it's a wonderful backdoor entry into the conversations around sort of bad art, neo-casualism, authenticity, and certainly in the crits I've been involved in over here during the last week, those things come up repeatedly. And so I think it's very lively for artists at this time to still be struggling with issues of authenticity. So, well, first of all, was that part of your consideration? Did it pop into your mind that, oh, this is a great way to open up that conversation? And second, you know, where do we stand in that relationship to sort of bad art and children's art and so on? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are things that I personally really like. I love folk art. I love untrained artists. I think, you know, I mean, a kind of, yeah, casualness. I would say that there's like a sort of, what I think I was tapping into, I would describe more as sort of a culture of like the amateur, and an interest. And this, I think, was a huge inspiration, as I mentioned before, was this project, The Outliers and American Vanguard Art by Lynn Cook, which was really thinking about a sort of broader history of folk art and of untrained artists. And I definitely was fascinated by children's relationship to all those things that you mentioned, to, you know, the bad and amateur and the untrained. Yeah, and the ways in which they sort of fit with those categories and the ways in which they don't. And I think that, you know, the idea that I was trying to evoke with the sort of proximity through the child to some of those other sort of forms through the child is one in which I feel like the child kind of resists its relationship to some of these other categories. So I think I would say that it wasn't primary, but inevitably in my interest in children's art was guided by my interest in, I would say, especially folk art and, you know, untrained artists. And then I think to a lesser degree, bad art. I do think just stylistically, like I can think of so many, you know, contemporary painters and photographers who are, you know, making work that looks like a child's. And I think there is a kind of aesthetic right now tendency to these kind of like rudimentary forms, to kind of, you know, this clashing of colors that I see and that I think young artists will find a lot of interest in some of the work that's in this exhibition, because it will feel, even if it's not contemporary, I think much of it will feel quite contemporary because of its aesthetics. So yeah, inevitably it wasn't conscious, but I think that, you know, my taste tends to go that direction. So probably it informed it.
Well, and also your antennae, you know, in terms of sensing, you know, because I do think it, again, it's an interesting backdoor entry into a very warm topic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, actually, Lynn Cook taught in our program for a year, and I think she gave a talk on folk art. Mm-hmm. So we can dig that out and share it with our community and send it your way if you would like that. Yeah. Any other questions for Ruth? This has been a really wonderful conversation. I know there were a lot of comments, but I don't know if those.
I know. I feel like you have to send me like the chat or something. I haven't been keeping up with it, but I want
to
see
all
we could
comments. Well, cool. Well, I don't see anyone else's new questions, so I want to say thank you, Ruth. And also, when is this? I know COVID's disrupted schedules, but is this meant to be up later this year, maybe next year, or what's the kind of proposed exhibition?
Yeah, it's so fall of 2022 is when it will be on view at the ICA. So.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for sharing this process. What an exciting thing to see the kind of ideas circulate around an exhibition, and they're so related to what we're talking about. So,
thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you tomorrow during the crits as well.
Can we all unmute again and give Ruth another hand, please?
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
You.